Hello everyone, my name is Elodie and I'm a historian. At 32 I thought my life was settled into a comfortable rhythm of dusty archives and obscure academic debates. I never imagined that the death of my estranged grandfather would plunge me into the middle of a family drama so intense. It would end with me standing on an auction stage, about to systematically destroy my family's inheritance. This is the story of how I uncovered a decades-old secret, a masterful fraud, and how, in honoring my grandfather's last wish, I found the sweetest and most poetic revenge imaginable. But before I dive into the story of the locked chest and the final confession that changed everything, I'm curious. Let me know where you're all watching from in the comments below. And if you've ever felt underestimated by the people who are supposed to believe in you the most, go ahead and hit that like button, because I have a feeling you'll understand exactly where I'm coming from. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to join our community of storytellers and survivors. The call I'd been subconsciously dreading my entire adult life came on a Tuesday. It was my Aunt Carol, her voice a familiar blend of brisk efficiency and barely concealed impatience. My grandfather, Arthur Vance, was dead. I hadn't seen him in person in over a decade, not since I was a gawky undergraduate student who had felt utterly out of place in his cavernous, intimidating home. Arthur Vance wasn't just my grandfather. He was a titan in the world of historical artifacts, a man whose name was synonymous with daring discoveries and priceless relics from the Elizabethan era. To the public he was a genius. To his own children, my mother who had passed years ago and my two uncles and aunt, he was a difficult, eccentric man whose primary value now in death was the immense fortune his collection was expected to fetch. To me he was a ghost, a myth. A man I knew more through his published works than through any personal connection. Aunt Carol got to the point with her usual lack of sentiment. Elodie, we need you. We need you to come to the estate and handle the archive. You're a historian, this is what you do. It needs to be inventoried and appraised before the auction. There was no, I'm sorry for your loss. There was no softness. It was a summons, not a request. She mentioned they would pay me a stipend, a figure that was insultingly low, framing it as if they were doing me a favor by letting me be near a collection historians would kill to access. I knew what they were really saying. Asterisk, you're the cheap option. You have a PhD in this stuff, so you can do the work of a whole team of expensive consultants for a fraction of the price. Asterisk, my Uncle Robert, a man who measured the world in profit margins, got on the extension line. It's a straightforward job, Elodie. Just catalog the big-ticket items so the auction house has the provenance paperwork. We're on a tight schedule. Sterling and Finch are handling the sale, and they want to move quickly to capitalize on the publicity of his passing. The cold, commercial reality of their grief or lack thereof was staggering. They weren't mourning a father. They were liquidating his assets. Against my better judgment, I agreed. A part of me, the small, hopeful part that never quite dies, thought that maybe this was a chance to connect with the memory of the man I barely knew. To walk through his library, to touch the things he loved and perhaps finally understand him. It was a foolish thought. The moment I arrived at the sprawling, ivy-choked estate, the frosty reception confirmed my role. I was the help. The house, which I remembered as a place of dark wood and whispering silence, now felt like a vulture's nest. My Aunt Carol, a woman who wore her wealth like armor, greeted me at the door with a critical once-over. Finally. We were beginning to think you'd gotten lost. The study is this way. I've had a cot brought in for you. It'll be easier if you just stay on site until the work is done. A cot. In the corner of a drafty ancillary room off the main library. Not a guest room, of which there were at least 6. The message was clear. I was not family, not here. I was a temporary and inconvenient necessity. Uncle Robert was on his phone, pacing in the grand entryway, talking loudly about capital gains. Uncle David, the quietest of the siblings, gave me a weak, apologetic smile but said nothing, already receding into the background, a perpetual follower in the wake of his more aggressive siblings. The first week was a grueling exercise in dust and dismissal. My grandfather's study was less an office and more a private museum, a testament to a life's obsession. Bookshelves groaned, stretching 2 stories high, accessible only by a rolling ladder. Flat file cabinets held delicate, browning maps. Glass cases displayed what the world believed to be priceless artifacts. A brass astrolabe supposedly from one of Drake's ships, a set of navigational tools, a pistol with an ornate flintlock mechanism rumored to have belonged to a famous corsair. My job was to create a comprehensive catalog, verifying each object against my grandfather's meticulous handwritten notes. The work itself was a historian's dream, a deep dive into a legendary collection. But the atmosphere was suffocating. At least twice a day, Carol or Robert would appear at the door. "How's it coming along, Elodie?" Robert would ask, not looking at me but at the most expensive-looking object in his line of sight. "Sterling needs the preliminary list by Friday. Focus on the high-value pieces. Don't get bogged down in the books." He said the word books with a faint sneer as if it were a dirty word. My entire life, my passion, my career was a thing to be dismissed. He saw the library not as a repository of knowledge, but as a high-volume, low-margin nuisance. Carol was worse. She would interrupt me while I was trying to decipher my grandfather's spidery handwriting or gently handle a fragile document. "Are you sure you know what you're doing? That looks very old. Don't break it. Its value is tied to its condition." Every word was a vote of no confidence. They saw my academic credentials not as proof of expertise, but as evidence that I was impractical, unsuited for the real world of money and commerce that they inhabited. They were a pack united in their greed, and I was the lone, inconvenient sheepdog they'd hired to round up their flock of golden geese. One afternoon, while sifting through a drawer filled with old photographs and correspondence, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a small, creased photograph, black and white, of a much younger Arthur Vance. He was standing beside a little girl with pigtails and a missing front tooth. Me. I couldn't have been more than 7 years old. He wasn't smiling, not in the conventional sense, but his eyes, even in the faded photograph, held a look of intense focus, a sort of quiet approval. He was showing me something, an old leather-bound book, his large, veiny hand guiding my small one across the page. I remembered that day. It was one of maybe 3 or 4 times I'd seen him in my childhood. My mother had brought me here, a rare visit. The other adults had been talking loudly in another room about things I didn't understand. Stocks, dividends, property. I had wandered off, drawn by the silence of the library. He had found me there, not scolding but simply observing. He hadn't said much. He just lifted a heavy atlas from a low shelf, opened it to a map of the New World crisscrossed with the routes of old explorers and said, "They thought the world was finite. They were wrong." He tapped my nose gently. "Never let anyone tell you where the edge of the map is, Elodie." That single memory, a tiny island in a sea of estrangement, was the spark that had ignited my love for history. It was the moment I realized that the past wasn't just a collection of dead facts. It was a series of stories, of adventures, of people who dared to sail off the edge of the known world. My grandfather had given me that. And his own children, now circling his legacy like sharks, had never once understood it. They'd seen his passion as an eccentric hobby that, thankfully, had turned out to be profitable. They had never seen the man, only his vault. The memory hardened something in me. This work was no longer just a job. It was a duty. A duty to him, to the ghost in the photograph who had told me to find my own edge of the map. The pressure campaign escalated a few days later. They called a formal meeting in the dining room, the long mahogany table polished to a mirror shine. Mr. Sterling, the head auctioneer, was there. He was a man who oozed expensive cologne and predatory charm. He laid out glossy brochures on the table, mock-ups of the auction catalog, with the star items featured in full-page spreads. "The Vance collection," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "It's not just an auction, it's a historic event. We're anticipating record-breaking bids, of course. The provenance is key. The stories sell the items." He turned to me, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Miss Vance, your grandfather's notes are impeccable, of course, but for pieces of this magnitude, we need a contemporary sign-off. A formality. Your validation as the family's historian will solidify the narrative and assuage any last-minute jitters from the big buyers." He pushed a sheaf of preliminary provenance reports across the table. They were for the top 5 items, including the so-called navigator's compass and the corsair's pistol. I felt a knot of dread in my stomach. It was one thing to catalog items. It was another to stake my professional reputation on their authenticity without having done the rigorous, independent verification required. I haven't had time to cross-reference everything," I stammered. "Some of these claims would require material analysis, carbon dating." Uncle Robert cut me off with a wave of his hand. Elodie, for heaven's sake. It's his own collection. Are you saying our father was a liar? Just sign the papers. It's a rubber stamp. You're part of the family. It just looks better. I'm part of the family when it's convenient for you, I thought. The pressure was immense. The three of them, plus Sterling, were all looking at me, their expressions ranging from impatience to outright annoyance. I felt small, powerless. I was the poor academic niece, the charity case. Arguing would be pointless. Reluctantly, feeling a deep sense of professional unease, I scribbled my name on the documents. It felt like a small betrayal. I didn't know then that it was the first tremor of an earthquake that would bring the whole house down. The discovery happened by accident. Driven by a need to escape the oppressive atmosphere, I had taken to exploring the less-traveled corners of the estate in the dead of night. There was a narrow, dusty storage closet off the back of the main library, filled with old traveling cloaks and forgotten umbrellas. It smelled of mothballs and thyme. Tucked away behind a row of heavy tweed coats, my hand brushed against something hard and wooden. I pushed the coats aside. There, sitting on the floor, was a chest. It was not a grand treasure chest, but a small, sturdy sea chest, bound with dark iron and weathered as if it had spent a century on the deck of a ship. What caught my eye was the lock. It wasn't a keyhole or a modern combination lock. It was a complex brass mechanism with 4 rotating dials, each etched with constellations and astronomical symbols. It was beautiful and strange. The next morning I mentioned it to Aunt Carol. She was in the middle of directing 2 movers who were wrapping a large vase in protective plastic. A chest? In the back closet, she said, distracted. Oh, that old thing. Arthur used to call it his folly box. It's been locked for as long I can remember. Probably full of junk. Just have the movers haul it out with the rest of the rubbish. We're trying to clear space. Rubbish. The word hung in the air. My grandfather had given it a name. It wasn't just a box. My instincts screamed at me. That night, after the house had fallen silent, the only sounds the creaks and groans of an old building settling, I went back to the closet. I dragged the heavy chest into the library, my muscles straining. I sat on the floor in the pool of light from my desk lamp and studied the lock. It was definitely a celestial lock. The dials corresponded to the position of stars. A random combination would be impossible. There were millions of permutations. It had to be a specific date, a specific moment in time, seen from a specific place on Earth. What would be significant to him? An Elizabethan historian? I thought back to the story he'd told me, the map he'd shown me. They thought the world was finite. Drake. Magellan. Frobisher. I pulled out my laptop and began researching key dates in the lives of the great explorers. Sir Francis Drake's circumnavigation was the most famous. I looked up the date he returned to Plymouth, a national hero. September 26, 1580. I found an online star chart simulator and set the location to Plymouth, England, and the date to the one I'd found. I painstakingly aligned the brass dials on the chest to match the positions of Polaris, Cassiopeia, and other key navigational stars from that night. I held my breath and gave the latch a gentle pull. Nothing. I tried other dates. The launching of the Golden Hind. The defeat of the Spanish Armada. Each time I meticulously set the dials, and each time the latch held firm. I was getting frustrated, tired. My mind felt fuzzy. I leaned back, looking around the library at the silent, watching books. My eyes fell on the photograph of me and him. On his face, that look of intense, quiet focus. What was he trying to tell me? Never let anyone tell you where the edge of the map is. It wasn't about the famous dates, the ones everyone knew. It had to be something personal. Something that mattered to him. What was the core of his academic work? It wasn't just the famous explorers. It was their secret histories, the things they didn't report to the Queen. The hidden truths. I remembered a footnote in one of his early, more obscure papers, a passionate argument about the true beginning of England's maritime supremacy. He argued it wasn't a famous battle, but a single secret charter granted to a lesser-known sea captain for a covert mission years before Drake became a household name. He'd been ridiculed for the theory at the time. It was a long shot. I found the paper in his bound journals. The date he proposed was April 12, 1568. A date no one else would ever consider significant. With a surge of adrenaline, I returned to the star chart simulator. I set the date and location, a small port on the Cornish coast mentioned in his paper. The star patterns were different, less obvious. I carefully turned the brass dials, their clicks echoing in the silent room. 1, 2, 3, 4. I paused, my hand hovering over the latch. This felt different. It felt right. I closed my eyes and pulled. With a low, satisfying thunk, the mechanism released. The chest was open. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I slowly lifted the heavy lid. The air that escaped smelled of old leather and paper and something else. Regret. I peered inside. It wasn't filled with gold or jewels. It wasn't filled with junk. It was almost empty. There was only a single object nestled in the center on a bed of faded velvet. A thick, hand-bound manuscript, its leather cover dark and unmarked. It felt heavy in my hands, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. I carried it to the desk, my hands trembling slightly, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was my grandfather's, but it was shakier than the neat script in his official journals, more urgent. The first line hit me like a physical blow. To my granddaughter, Elodie. If you are reading this, it means you were clever enough to find it and I am long gone. It is time for the truth. The confession began with his early life. I read for hours, completely lost to the world, as the sun began to cast its first pale light through the tall library windows. He wrote not as Arthur Vance, the celebrated historian, but as a young, ambitious, and deeply insecure scholar, desperate to make a name for himself in a field dominated by old money and established reputations. He described how his early legitimate research was dismissed by the academic establishment. They called his theories fanciful, his evidence circumstantial. He was an outsider and they made sure he knew it. The bitterness and frustration bled through the pages. Then came the story of his first great discovery. The navigator's compass. He hadn't found it on a dive off the coast as the official story went. He had fabricated it. He was a brilliant craftsman, a skill he'd learned from his own father, a watchmaker. He'd studied the materials, the methods, the aging processes. He created a fake artifact so perfect, so plausible that it fooled everyone. He'd intended it only as a way to get his foot in the door, to force the establishment to listen to his real theories. But it had worked too well. The fame was instantaneous, intoxicating. It brought grants, accolades, and respect. But it also trapped him. One lie had led to another. The Corsair's pistol, the astrolabe of Frobisher, the star chart sextant. All of them, his most celebrated finds, were masterpieces of his own creation. He was a fraud. As I read, my image of him fractured and reformed. The towering, intimidating figure of my youth dissolved, replaced by a tragic, flawed, and profoundly lonely man. He had built a brilliant career on a foundation of lies, and had been imprisoned by it ever since. I felt a wave of unexpected compassion for him. He had been so desperate for the world to see his intellect that he had resorted to a grand deception, and had paid the price with a lifetime of private torment. I turned a page and the tone of the manuscript shifted. But a liar sometimes stumbles upon the truth, he wrote. And I did, Elodie. I stumbled upon something real. Something so magnificent, so historically significant, that it dwarfed all of my forgeries. I found it in a forgotten corner of a private library in Seville, a place my fame had granted me access to. It was miscatalogued, dismissed as a collection of devotional poetry. But it wasn't. He went on to describe what he had found. A small leather-bound folio containing a series of personal letters. They were written by Queen Elizabeth I, not to a minister or a general, but to her spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham. They were her most private thoughts, her fears, her strategies, written during the height of the crisis with Spain. They were a direct window into the mind of one of history's most enigmatic monarchs, a discovery that would rewrite entire chapters of Tudor history. He called it the Walsingham Correspondence. He knew with sickening certainty that he could never reveal it. To present a genuine find of that magnitude would invite a level of scrutiny that his fraudulent collection could never withstand. His entire legacy would be exposed. So he hid it. He secreted the letters away, his one real treasure, his greatest shame and his greatest triumph, known only to him. My hands were shaking as I read the final section. My children, he wrote, the words full of a weary sadness, see only the gold, not the history. They will sell my life's work to the highest bidder without a second thought. They do not deserve the truth and they would not know what to do with it if they had it. But you, Elodie, you have my spark. You have the curiosity that I was forced to corrupt. The Walsingham correspondence is my penance, and it is my gift to you. And then came the legal language, precise and ironclad. He declared the manuscript to be a holographic codicil to his will. He bequeathed the specific item known as the Walsingham correspondence and it alone to me, his granddaughter, Elodie Vance. He described it in painstaking detail, enough for a legal identification. At the bottom were 2 signatures, dated 5 years prior, under a witness attestation clause. 2 of his old, trusted university colleagues, both of whom I knew had passed away within the last year. It was legal. It was binding. And it was a bomb. But where were the letters? The manuscript held the final piece of the puzzle, the cipher. It wasn't a complex string of numbers, but a riddle, woven into a paragraph that seemed, at first glance, to be a simple reflection on his life. My greatest truth is hidden where my first lie began, but viewed through the lens of my deepest regret. The map is not on the page but in the spaces between. Look for the silent servant who holds up the world, and there you will find the Queen's words. I read the passage a dozen times. Where my first lie began, that had to be the navigator's compass. It was on display in a glass case in the center of the library. Viewed through the lens of my deepest regret. The manuscript was filled with regret, but the most profound was his deception of the academic community, particularly his old mentor, a Professor Albright, whom he'd betrayed by letting him champion the fake compass. I found a book Albright had written, a glowing tribute to Arthur's discoveries. What about this silent servant who holds up the world? I scanned the library. My eyes landed on the massive ornate globe that stood in the corner, a replica from the 16th century. It wasn't the globe itself. It was the stand. The figure holding it up was a carving of Atlas. The map is not on the page but in the spaces between. I knelt by the globe, my heart racing. I looked at the compass, then through the book by Professor Albright, using it like a lens. It was a crazy idea. It did nothing. I was misinterpreting it. The lens of my deepest regret. It wasn't the book. It was more literal. I looked at the navigator's compass in its case. The glass cover was thick. But the compass itself had a glass lens set in its brass housing. His regret was the lie itself. The compass. I unlocked the case, my fingers fumbling with the tiny key. I gently lifted the heavy, fraudulent object. I carried it over to the Atlas globe. I held the compass up, peering through its lens at the carved wooden figure of Atlas. The glass was old and slightly distorted the view. But as I moved it, a trick of the light, or perhaps an intentional flaw in the glass he'd made, caused a tiny rainbow to appear on the surface of the wood. And in the center of that spectral light, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a faint marking. A single, small brass knob, disguised as part of the decorative carving on Atlas's back. I pushed it. With a soft click, a section of the wooden globe stand slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a simple leather thong, was a small, flat folio. My breath caught in my throat. I untied the thong and opened the cover. The paper was vellum, the ink was faded iron gall, and the handwriting was the unmistakable elegant script of a Tudor royal. I was holding a letter from Queen Elizabeth I. I had found it. The next few days were a blur of secret activity. I had to work quickly and carefully, all while maintaining the fiction that I was merely finishing the auction catalog. My family's intrusions became almost unbearable. Uncle Robert found me in the library, poring over a book on 16th century inks. "Elodie, are you still dawdling with these books? The auction is in 3 days. Mr. Sterling needs the final catalog descriptions. He's concerned you're not taking this seriously." "I am taking this very seriously," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "I want to ensure every detail is absolutely correct." He patted me on the shoulder in a condescending gesture. "Good girl. Just remember what's at stake. This is our one chance to secure our futures. Don't mess it up." The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. That afternoon, Aunt Carol staged her own little ambush. She came in with a cup of tea, a gesture so out of character it immediately set me on edge. "You've been working so hard, dear," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "I just wanted to make sure you were feeling all right. You seemed tense." She was probing, trying to see if I was going to be a problem. "Just tired," I said, forcing a smile. "It's a lot of pressure." Yes, well, it will all be over soon, she said, her eyes scanning my desk. I had the real correspondence hidden, but my grandfather's manuscript was tucked under a pile of other papers. She gestured towards it. What's that old thing? More of his rambling notes. Exactly, I said, my heart skipping a beat. Just some early draft. Nothing important. She accepted it, her suspicion momentarily quieted. But it was a close call. The near miss solidified my plan. I couldn't just take the letters and leave. That would be theft in their eyes, and they would drag me through a legal battle that I couldn't afford, no matter how strong my claim. The codicil was my legal shield, but my grandfather's confession was my sword. I had to expose the fraud. I had to dismantle the entire foundation of their greed. It wasn't just about claiming my inheritance. It was about honoring his final desperate act of honesty. It was about justice for him and for me. The night before the auction I did two things. First, I scanned the key pages of the manuscript and the first and last letters of the Walsingham correspondence. I emailed them to a trusted former professor, a leading expert in Tudor documents, with a subject line that read, "Hypothetical query urgent." His automated reply said he was at a conference in Berlin but would respond as soon as he could. It was a long shot, but I needed an external, unimpeachable opinion in my back pocket. Second, I carefully placed the original manuscript and the legal codicil into a formal legal folio. I then took the precious, authentic letters, wrapped them carefully and placed them in my satchel. I was ready. The day of the auction was unnaturally bright, the sun glinting off the polished cars arriving at the grand entrance of the Sterling and Finch auction house. The main gallery was packed with the kind of people who treat history as a commodity. Wealthy collectors with bored expressions, museum curators with anxious eyes, and investors looking for tangible assets. The air was thick with money and anticipation. I saw my family in the front row. Aunt Carol was wearing a Chanel suit and far too much jewelry, looking for all the world like the lady of the manor. Uncle Robert was schmoozing with a man who looked like a minor European royal. Uncle David just looked nervous, constantly fidgeting with his tie. They were beaming, intoxicated by the proximity to such vast, imagined wealth. They saw me slip into a seat at the back and Carol gave me a curt, dismissive nod as if to say, "Good, the help has arrived." I clutched the folio in my lap, my hands surprisingly steady. The storm of anxiety I had expected was absent, replaced by a cold, clear calm. Mr. Sterling took the podium, his voice resonating through the hushed room. He started with a few lesser items, warming up the crowd. A silver snuff box, a set of antique maps. The bids were brisk. Then he moved to the main event. A hush fell over the room as the spotlight centered on a velvet-draped pedestal. With a flourish, an assistant removed the covering to reveal the navigator's compass. It gleamed under the lights, a masterpiece of fraudulent art. "And now," Sterling began, his voice dropping to a dramatic, reverent tone, "the centerpiece of the legendary Vance collection. The compass that guided Sir Francis Drake himself, a tangible piece of the golden age of exploration." He went on for a few minutes, weaving the fabricated tale my grandfather had created decades ago. My family was soaking it in, their faces glowing with pride and avarice. Then Sterling did exactly what I had prayed he would do. He wanted to add a personal touch to drive the provenance home, and to say a few words about her grandfather's incredible legacy and the rigorous work of authentication that has gone into this collection. We are honored to have with us today the archivist of the Vance estate, a fine historian in her own right, his granddaughter, Miss Elodie Vance. A polite smattering of applause rippled through the room. My Aunt Carol looked over her shoulder at me and smiled, a tight, triumphant little smile that said, "Asterisk, now do your part. Make us rich." Asterisk. I walked slowly to the stage, the folio held firmly in my hand. My footsteps echoed in the silent room. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me. I reached the podium, adjusted the microphone and looked out not at the crowd but directly at my family. I gave them a small, unreadable smile. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," I began, my voice clear and steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "My grandfather, Arthur Vance, was a brilliant man. A man of immense talent and deep, deep passions. He was also, in his final years, a man of profound conscience." I saw a flicker of confusion on Robert's face. This wasn't the script. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air. Then I opened the folio. It wasn't filled with notes for a speech. It was the manuscript. He left a final testament, I continued, not just to his life but to his work. A confession. He wanted the truth to be known. I looked down at the page and read the first line of his confession about the compass. The navigator's compass, he writes, was my first and greatest lie. A perfect forgery born of desperation and vanity. It is made of 19th-century naval brass and a pin from a Birmingham factory, artificially aged in a brine of my own invention. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. It was a physical wave of sound. Mr. Sterling's face went from a confident pink to a ghastly, waxy white. My family had frozen, their smiles plastered on their faces, their brains clearly not processing what they were hearing. I didn't stop. I calmly turned the page. The Corsair's pistol, I announced, my voice ringing with authority, is a clever assemblage of a common Belgian trade gun and a handle carved from a piece of a Victorian writing desk. The astrolabe is a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, but it was crafted in 1978 in my grandfather's own workshop. The room erupted. Shouts of "What is the meaning of this?" and "Is this a joke?" filled the air. My family finally snapped out of their paralysis. Uncle Robert was on his feet, his face purple with rage. "She's lying. She's a disgruntled, jealous nobody. Security, get her off the stage." Aunt Carol was screaming, "Slander. We'll sue you into the ground, you ungrateful little witch." But I held up a hand and to my astonishment, the room quieted slightly, the collectors and experts mesmerized by the sheer audacity of the drama. "My grandfather was a brilliant forger," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "He fooled the entire world for 50 years. I have his signed confession right here. And as a historian specializing in this period, I have already begun my own analysis. The material inconsistencies are, upon closer inspection, undeniable." I gestured to Mr. Sterling, who looked like he was about to faint. "I suggest Sterling and Finch withdraw the entire collection for independent verification before they destroy their own reputation by auctioning a collection of fakes." Pandemonium. The auction was over. People were shouting, standing on their chairs. The press, who had been there to cover the record-breaking sale, were now swarming the stage, their cameras flashing. In the midst of the chaos, I presented the manuscript to a stunned-looking man in a suit, who I correctly guessed was the auction house's lawyer. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an email from my professor in Berlin. "Elodie, my God. Where did you get these scans? The script is unmistakable. If this is real, it's the find of the century." I smiled. The final piece was in place. I turned from the podium and walked to the edge of the stage, looking down at my family. Their rage had collapsed into utter, desolate shock. They looked like statues of ruin. "The inheritance you were so desperate to liquidate," I said, my voice low now, "just for them, is worthless. An illusion. Just a pile of cleverly disguised junk." Carol stared at me, her mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. Robert looked utterly broken, his dreams of a financial dynasty evaporating before his eyes. "But my grandfather," I continued, pulling the final page from my folio, "did not leave me with nothing." I held up the page with the codicil, its legal language clear and damning. "He left me the only real thing he ever found. The one piece of his legacy that wasn't a lie." I didn't need to tell them what it was. The look on their faces, the dawning horror, the impotent fury, the sickening understanding of what they had lost, was enough. I turned my back on them, on the chaos, on the flashing lights. I walked off the stage, my satchel with the real letters held tight to my side, and didn't look back. The auction house was a madhouse, but the library was an oasis of perfect, blessed silence. I had returned to the estate, slipping past the shell-shocked remnants of my family who were huddled in the living room, their angry whispers the only sound. In the study, under the warm glow of the desk lamp, I had carefully laid out the Walsingham correspondence. The vellum was cool to the touch, the iron gall ink a testament to a queen's private fears and resolve. I traced the elegant script with my finger, a direct connection across 400 years of history. This was real. This was truth. The sound of the library door slamming open shattered the peace. Aunt Carol stood there, her face a mess of ruined makeup and pure desperation. The carefully constructed armor of her wealth and arrogance had been stripped away, leaving something raw and pathetic. "You," she hissed, her voice ragged. How could you do this to us? To the family. What family, Carol? I asked, not even looking up from the letters. The family that put me on a cot in a storage room? The family that dismissed my entire life's work as a nuisance? The family that saw a dead father as a winning lottery ticket? We took you in, she shrieked, taking a step forward. We gave you this opportunity. You hired cheap labor, I corrected her calmly. And I did the job. I authenticated the collection. It just wasn't the result you were hoping for. Her anger suddenly deflated, replaced by a wheedling, grasping tone that was far more repulsive. That thing, she said, gesturing wildly at the letters on the desk. The lawyers are saying your paper is legal. Must be worth a fortune. Elodie, please. You have to share it. We're your blood. You can't just take everything. I finally looked up at her and I felt nothing but a vast, weary pity. She still didn't get it. He never would. This isn't about money, I said, my voice quiet but firm. It never was, not for me and not for him. This is about history. It's about truth. He wanted his assets. He gave me his legacy. There's a difference. I stood up, gathering the precious letters into their folio. The auction is over, Aunt Carol. Your inheritance is gone. There's nothing left for you here. I met her gaze, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the intimidated little niece. I was the one with the power. Please leave. This is my study now. She stared at me, speechless, her face crumbling as the finality of her ruin settled upon her. She turned without another word and stumbled out of the room, a ghost in her own house. Later that evening, Uncle Robert tried a different tactic. He cornered me in the hallway, his face dark with a controlled fury. He tried to bluster, to threaten. You've committed libel, Elodie. We'll tie you up in court for years. You'll never work in academia again. We'll take those letters, we'll prove you forged that ridiculous will. I just looked at him. With what money, Robert? The auction house is considering suing you for misrepresentation. Your father's entire estate is likely insolvent once his debts and the cost of this disaster are tallied up. You have nothing to fight me with. I showed him the email from my professor, whose name even Robert recognized as a giant in the field. The world's foremost tutor expert has already seen scans. He's calling it the find of the century. You have no case. You have no money. You have no power here anymore. He deflated like a punctured balloon, the empty threats dying on his lips. He simply stared at me, his eyes filled with a hatred that was as deep as it was impotent. The last one to approach me was Uncle David. He knocked softly on the library door late that night. He looked tired and small. Can I come in? He asked. I nodded. He didn't look at the letters, he looked at me. I'm sorry, Elodie, he said, his voice barely a whisper. We were wrong. So wrong. He was always so proud of you, you know. He'd read your papers. He kept a file with all your articles. He gestured to a filing cabinet in the corner. He didn't know how to talk to us. All we ever talked about was money. It's all we knew. It was a weak, flimsy apology, the excuse of a man who had stood by and done nothing his entire life. But it was, I sensed, the best he could do. It was the first honest thing any of them had said to me. Thank you for saying that, David, I said. It wasn't forgiveness. The chasm between us was too vast to be bridged by a single, belated apology. But it was an ending. A quiet, sad, and necessary one. The house was sold a few months later for a fraction of its imagined value, just the worth of the land and the building itself. The proceeds were swallowed whole by the legal fallout and my grandfather's outstanding debts. As I had predicted, my family was left with nothing but the public humiliation and the bitter ashes of their greed. 6 months after that explosive day, I stood at a different kind of podium. This one was in a lecture hall at my university, packed with students, professors, and historians who had flown in from around the world. The screen behind me showed a high-resolution image of a letter from the Walsingham correspondence. My paper, The Queen's Private War, a new perspective from the Walsingham correspondence, was causing an earthquake in the historical community. It was rewriting the narrative of a pivotal moment in English history. I had done it. I had honored my grandfather's truth, the brilliant real discovery he'd been forced to hide. I had brought his one true legacy into the light. The fraud of the Vance collection was now just a footnote, a bizarre story of a brilliant man's tragic compromise. But the Walsingham correspondence, that was becoming his monument. My family had scattered to the winds. Carol and Robert were no longer speaking. I heard through the grapevine that Robert's business had suffered badly in the scandal. David sent me a single awkward Christmas card. I never replied. Their chapter in my life was closed. In clearing out his office, I found the file David had mentioned. It was thick with my own work. My master's thesis, my doctoral dissertation, every obscure article I'd ever published in academic journals. He had printed them all. In the margins of one of my first papers in his spidery script was a single note. Asterisk, she has it. The spark. Asterisk, tears had streamed down my face as I read it. All those years I had felt so disconnected from him, so unseen. But he had been watching. He had been proud. I had been seeking validation from my aunts and uncles, people who were incapable of giving it. I'd craved the approval of a family who defined worth by a price tag. But the one person whose approval truly mattered, the man who had set me on my path with a single sentence about the edge of a map, had given it to me long ago. He hadn't just left me a priceless artifact. He had left me his truth, his trust, and his legacy. He had seen me for who I was. In the end, I didn't need to destroy their inheritance for revenge. I just had to tell the truth. Their greed destroyed the rest all on its own. They thought the treasure was the gold-plated lies, but the real treasure was the quiet, ink-stained truth, and it was a language only I could understand. So, what have I learned from all this? I've learned that your value is not determined by the people who refuse to see it. It's inherent. It's in your passion, your integrity, and the quiet work you do when no one is watching. Sometimes, being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have. It allows you to move silently, to learn, to prepare. And when the time comes, it allows you to show them who you really are, not with anger but with undeniable, irrefutable truth. Thank you all so much for listening to my story. It's a strange and complicated part of my life, but sharing it feels like the final, closing chapter. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between a difficult truth and an easy lie? What did you do? Your stories give strength to all of us. Don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, and please subscribe for more stories about finding your own strength in the most unexpected places. Thank you again for joining me. Remember that true worth is never determined by an auction block, but by the legacy you build and the truth you choose to live.